The deepest betrayals rarely leave visible scars, but they can change the course of an entire life. Nathan Hayes had built his reputation on discipline, loyalty, and quiet strength, believing that trust was the one foundation no fortune could ever replace. Yet everything he believed shattered in a single evening when the marriage he had spent years protecting came to an unexpected end. The elegant mansion that had once echoed with conversations suddenly felt impossibly silent as Nathan returned long after midnight, exhausted by difficult decisions and carrying a weight that no amount of success could lighten. Without turning on the grand chandelier that illuminated the entrance hall, he walked slowly through the dark rooms, removed his tailored jacket, and left it neatly across the back of a chair before disappearing upstairs. Outside, gentle rain tapped against the tall windows while the rest of the estate slept peacefully, unaware that its owner no longer recognized the life he had built. The following morning, warm sunlight streamed through the bedroom curtains much later than Nathan usually allowed himself to wake. He sat quietly on the edge of the bed, gathering enough energy to face another unfamiliar day. For the first time in many years, there was nowhere he urgently needed to be. As he stepped into the upstairs hallway, the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread and brewed coffee drifted from the kitchen below. The ordinary scent felt strangely unfamiliar after so much emotional turmoil. Nathan followed it downstairs, expecting to find only the morning staff completing their routine duties. Instead, he stopped in the doorway. Standing beside the large farmhouse sink was Evan Brooks, the young Omega maid who had worked at the estate for nearly 2 years. Evan was carefully arranging breakfast on a wooden serving tray while wearing a crisp white dress shirt that Nathan immediately recognized as his own. The sleeves were slightly too long, neatly folded back at the wrists, and the shirt fit loosely enough to reveal that it had clearly never belonged to its current wearer. Startled by Nathan's unexpected arrival, Evan almost dropped the stack of clean plates he was carrying. His cheeks turned bright with embarrassment as he quickly set everything safely onto the counter. "Good morning, sir," he said softly. "I am so sorry. I should have explained before you saw me." Nathan glanced from the familiar shirt to Evan's anxious expression, but said nothing. Evan nervously continued, "My uniform became soaked this morning while I was cleaning the laundry room after one of the water pipes started leaking. Mrs. Collins said I would catch a cold if I stayed in wet clothes, so she found this shirt in the guest wardrobe and said it would be acceptable until my uniform dried. I plan to change back as soon as possible." Nathan looked toward the elderly housekeeper, who had just entered the kitchen carrying a basket of freshly folded towels. She gave a gentle nod that quietly confirmed every word. There was no awkward excuse, no hidden intention, only a simple act of practical kindness shared between members of the household. Nathan slowly looked back at Evan, who still appeared worried that he had done something terribly wrong. Instead of anger, Nathan felt something entirely unexpected. After the disappointment of the previous night, the sincerity before him seemed almost unfamiliar. Evan's concern was not for himself, but for whether he had unintentionally caused discomfort to someone else. Nathan noticed the careful way breakfast had been prepared, the fresh flowers placed in a small vase at the center of the table, and the peaceful atmosphere that filled the once-empty kitchen. None of it had been arranged to impress anyone. It was simply the result of someone taking quiet pride in caring for others. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, Nathan felt the heaviness inside his heart ease, if only by the smallest measure. He gently shook his head and offered a calm smile. "You do not need to apologize," he said. "It is only a shirt." Evan blinked in surprise before returning a grateful smile of his own. Neither of them realized that this ordinary morning, shaped by an unexpected gesture and a borrowed white shirt, had quietly become the first page of a story that would change both of their lives forever. The borrowed white shirt was neatly folded and placed on the kitchen counter before lunchtime, freshly washed and carefully pressed, as though Evan Brooks hoped that every crease he removed might also erase the awkwardness of the morning. Nathan Hayes noticed it immediately when he walked into the kitchen after finishing several long phone calls with attorneys and business advisors. The conversations had been exhausting, filled with practical decisions that demanded calm judgment even while his personal life remained unsettled. Yet the atmosphere inside the kitchen felt entirely different. Sunlight streamed through the large windows overlooking the estate garden, Fresh herbs filled small ceramic pots along the windowsill, and the comforting scent of homemade vegetable soup drifted gently through the room. Evan was quietly preparing lunch for the household staff, while humming a melody so softly that he seemed unaware anyone else could hear it. When he realized Nathan had entered, the tune stopped at once. "Good afternoon, sir," Evan said with his usual polite smile. "Your shirt is clean. Thank you again for allowing me to borrow it." Nathan looked at the neatly folded shirt before turning his attention back to Evan. "I told you this morning that you did not need to apologize." Evan nodded with a modest smile. "I know. I simply wanted to return it exactly as I received it." Nathan noticed that every button had been fastened, every sleeve carefully aligned, and even the collar had been pressed with remarkable attention to detail. It was a simple gesture, but it reflected the same quiet care Nathan had begun noticing throughout the house. Fresh flowers had appeared in the dining room without anyone asking. The library windows had been opened to let in the spring air. Even the elderly gardener had mentioned during breakfast that Evan had helped carry heavy pots across the courtyard before beginning his own duties. None of those actions had been announced or praised. They simply happened because Evan believed helping others was part of everyday life. Nathan poured himself a cup of coffee and remained in the kitchen instead of returning immediately to his office. After a few moments of comfortable silence, he asked, "How long have you worked here?" Evan carefully placed fresh bread into a basket before answering. "Almost 2 years." Nathan looked surprised. "It feels as though I have only recently begun noticing you." Evan laughed quietly, though there was no sadness behind it. "That is probably because I try not to disturb anyone. If the house runs smoothly, then I have done my job well." Nathan considered the answer thoughtfully. For years he had become accustomed to people competing for his attention, asking for favors, recognition, or opportunities. Evan seemed completely different. He appeared happiest when everything around him worked peacefully without anyone noticing his efforts. "Mrs. Collins speaks very highly of you," Nathan said. Evan smiled with genuine affection. "She taught me almost everything I know about taking care of a home. She always reminds me that people should feel comfortable the moment they walk through the front door." Nathan slowly looked around the bright kitchen, realizing that despite everything he had experienced recently, the estate no longer felt empty. It felt welcoming again. The credit belonged not to expensive furniture or elegant architecture, but to the quiet people who cared for it every day. Before leaving, Nathan picked up the neatly folded white shirt and paused beside the doorway. "Keep it for now," he said calmly. Evan looked surprised. "Sir," Nathan smiled gently, "your uniform is still drying, and it suits you better than spending another day worrying about wet clothes." Evan hesitated before accepting the offer with sincere gratitude. "Thank you. I will take very good care of it." Nathan nodded and quietly walked toward his office, carrying only his coffee while leaving the shirt behind. As he crossed the peaceful hallway lined with family photographs and sunlight, he realized that for the first time in many weeks, the silence inside the mansion no longer felt lonely. Somehow, through ordinary conversations, thoughtful gestures, and a borrowed white shirt, a quiet sense of comfort had begun finding its way back into a place that had almost forgotten what warmth felt like. Over the following weeks, life inside the Hayes estate settled into a peaceful rhythm that Nathan Hayes had almost forgotten was possible. The legal matters surrounding the end of his marriage continued moving forward through attorneys and advisors, yet he no longer allowed those conversations to define every hour of his day. Instead, he gradually began noticing the quiet details that had always existed around him but had gone unseen for years. Every morning fresh flowers appeared on the dining table before sunrise. The library remained perfectly organized without anyone asking. The garden pathways were always swept clean before the first rays of sunlight reached the old oak trees. None of these thoughtful touches carried anyone's signature, yet Nathan slowly realized they almost always led back to one person. Evan Brooks never sought attention for anything he did. One afternoon, Nathan happened to finish a business meeting earlier than expected and decided to walk through the estate gardens before returning to his office. As he approached the greenhouse, he noticed Evan kneeling beside several newly planted rose bushes, carefully supporting each young stem with small wooden stakes so they would grow straight during the coming season. Nearby, the elderly gardener smiled warmly while watching Evan work. Nathan greeted them both before asking, I thought gardening was not part of your responsibilities." Evan stood and brushed a little soil from his gloves with an embarrassed smile. "It is not. Mr. Harris hurt his shoulder lifting heavy flower pots last week, so I wanted to make his day a little easier until he feels better." Mr. Harris chuckled softly. "He has been helping me every morning before he even starts his own work." Nathan looked from one man to the other without saying anything for several seconds. Later that afternoon, he quietly asked Mrs. Collins about Evan. The experienced housekeeper smiled knowingly, almost as though she had expected the question for some time. She explained that Evan regularly sent much of his paycheck to help his widowed mother and younger sister, volunteered at a neighborhood food pantry on his days off, and often covered extra household duties whenever another employee faced a family emergency. "Has he ever asked for a raise or special treatment?" Nathan wondered aloud. Mrs. Collins gently shook her head. "Never once. In fact, he usually worries more about everyone else than he does about himself." Those words remained with Nathan long after the conversation ended. Curious to understand more, he quietly observed the daily life inside his own home over the following several days. He noticed Evan carrying groceries inside before anyone else arrived, helping the chef prepare meals for employees working late, repairing a child's broken toy that belonged to the groundskeeper's grandson, and leaving handwritten notes of encouragement for a housekeeper studying evening classes after work. Each act was small on its own, almost invisible to anyone rushing through the day, yet together they created an atmosphere of warmth that quietly touched every person living and working at the estate. One rainy evening, Nathan stood near the upstairs window overlooking the courtyard as employees finished their shifts and prepared to leave. Before walking through the front gate, several members of the household naturally gathered around Evan, laughing together as he shared fresh bread he had baked that afternoon. No one seemed impressed by his position. They simply enjoyed being around him because he made ordinary moments brighter. Nathan suddenly understood something that had never occurred to him before. Real influence was not measured by power, wealth, or reputation. It was measured by the number of people who felt valued after spending time with someone. Looking down toward the courtyard, Nathan realized that while he had spent years building an empire, Evan had quietly built something just as remarkable inside the walls of his own home. For the first time, Nathan found himself wondering not how to reward Evan for his hard work, but how to protect and encourage a kindness that had already begun changing the lives of everyone fortunate enough to know him, including his own. Spring gradually gave way to early summer, and the Hayes estate seemed brighter with every passing week. The gardens bloomed with fresh color. The halls echoed once again with quiet conversation, and Nathan Hayes found himself spending less time behind the closed doors of his office and more time walking through the home that had slowly become welcoming again. One afternoon, he invited every member of the household staff to gather in the sunlit breakfast room for an announcement. The request surprised everyone because formal meetings of that kind were rare. Evan Brooks quietly took a seat beside Mrs. Collins, assuming the discussion would concern schedules or seasonal maintenance. Instead, Nathan stood before the group with an expression of calm determination that immediately captured everyone's attention. "For many years," Nathan began, "I believed that providing a paycheck was enough to show appreciation. I have recently realized that respect should be demonstrated through daily actions, not only through contracts." The room became completely silent. Nathan explained that every employee at the estate would receive expanded health benefits, additional paid vacation days, and opportunities for professional education if they wished to continue learning new skills. He also announced plans to renovate the staff living quarters, replace outdated appliances, create a comfortable recreation lounge, and establish a scholarship fund for the children of employees pursuing higher education. Several members of the staff exchanged emotional glances, hardly believing what they were hearing. Mrs. Collins quietly wiped away a tear before smiling with unmistakable pride. Evan remained speechless, his hands resting neatly in his lap as he listened to every word. After the meeting ended, employees gathered in small groups throughout the house, talking excitedly about the unexpected changes. Nathan noticed their genuine happiness, but his attention was drawn to Evan, who slipped quietly into the courtyard instead of joining the celebration. Curious, Nathan followed him outside and found him standing beside the rose bushes they had planted together weeks earlier. "You should be celebrating with everyone else," Nathan said gently. Evan smiled as he looked across the colorful garden. I am celebrating. I just wanted a quiet moment first. Nathan stepped beside him. You seem happier for everyone else than for yourself. Evan nodded without hesitation. Because they deserve it. Many of them have worked here much longer than I have. They have families, children, and dreams they quietly put aside while taking care of this home. Seeing them smile today feels wonderful. Nathan looked at Evan thoughtfully before asking, Did you know I was planning this? Evan quickly shook his head. No, sir. But I am glad you did. Nathan remained silent for a moment before speaking honestly. I cannot take all the credit. Watching the way you treat people made me realize I had overlooked many things that truly matter. Evan lowered his eyes with visible embarrassment. I only try to do what I believe is right. That, Nathan replied, is exactly what changed my perspective. As they walked slowly through the garden paths, Nathan shared another idea that had been growing in his mind. His family foundation had supported charitable organizations for years, but much of the work had become distant and administrative. He wanted to rebuild those programs so they focused more directly on local communities. I would like someone with genuine compassion to help me understand what people actually need, Nathan explained. Evan looked surprised and immediately answered, I am not qualified for something like that. Nathan smiled warmly. Kindness is a qualification that cannot be taught in any classroom. Evan laughed softly, still uncertain, but Nathan could already see the quiet confidence hidden beneath his modesty. As a gentle breeze carried the fragrance of blooming roses across the estate, neither of them realized that the conversation beginning beside those flower beds would soon lead them beyond the gates of the mansion, allowing them to build not only a stronger community, but also a future neither of them had ever imagined. By the middle of summer, the Hayes Family Foundation had quietly begun transforming from a name printed on annual reports into something people could genuinely experience. Nathan Hayes decided that every new project would begin by listening instead of assuming, and, to his surprise, the person who offered the clearest understanding of everyday needs was Evan Brooks. Although Evan repeatedly insisted that he was only a housemaid with no special qualifications, Nathan continued inviting him to planning meetings, community visits, and conversations with local nonprofit organizations. During the first visit to a neighborhood community center, Nathan arrived with several advisors carrying notebooks filled with statistics, financial projections, and development plans. Evan arrived carrying nothing more than a reusable shopping bag filled with homemade muffins that he had baked before sunrise. Within minutes, children gathered around Evan while older residents greeted him as though they had known him for years. He listened patiently to every story, remembered every name after hearing it only once, and asked simple questions that made people feel genuinely heard. Nathan stood quietly nearby, realizing that meaningful leadership often began with listening instead of speaking. On the drive back to the estate, Nathan finally broke the comfortable silence inside the car. You notice things none of us even thought to ask about, he said. Evan looked out the window at the passing countryside before answering with his usual modest smile. People usually tell you what they need if they believe you truly care about the answer. Those words stayed with Nathan throughout the following weeks as the foundation launched new programs focused on school supplies, neighborhood gardens, weekend meal distributions, and educational workshops for families. Rather than simply writing checks, Nathan personally attended many of the events alongside volunteers. Evan naturally became the person connecting everyone together. He greeted every volunteer with the same warmth he showed the household staff, remembered birthdays, helped organize supplies, and somehow found time to encourage every nervous first-time volunteer before each event began. One Saturday morning, they spent nearly 6 hours helping prepare a community picnic in a local park. Children laughed while painting flower pots, families shared homemade recipes, and local musicians played cheerful songs beneath rows of maple trees. Nathan noticed that Evan moved from table to table without ever seeking attention, quietly making certain everyone felt included. When an elderly gentleman struggled to carry folding chairs across the grass, Evan immediately walked over to help. When a shy little boy hesitated to join the other children, Evan knelt beside him until they walked together toward the painting table. None of those moments appeared on official schedules, yet they became the memories people carried home. As the afternoon came to an end, Nathan and Evan remained behind with several volunteers to fold tables and load supplies into trucks. The summer air remained warm even as the sun slowly drifted toward the horizon. Nathan handed Evan a bottle of cold water before smiling. "You have changed this foundation more than any consultant ever could." Evan laughed softly and shook his head. "I think people simply needed someone to notice them." Nathan looked across the now quiet park where families were walking home together carrying flowers, books, and smiling children. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he realized that the peace he had been searching for after his life had changed so suddenly had never been waiting inside expensive offices or grand estates. It had been quietly growing beside him through ordinary acts of compassion, shared mornings, thoughtful conversations, and countless small choices made without expecting recognition. As they walked back toward the parked car beneath the golden evening sky, Nathan found himself looking forward to tomorrow with a feeling he had not experienced in a very long time. Because somewhere along the journey of helping others, he had begun healing alongside the one person who had never asked for anything in return. By the time autumn arrived, helping the community had become a natural part of everyday life for both Nathan Hayes and Evan Brooks. What had begun as occasional visits through the Hayes Family Foundation gradually evolved into a shared routine that neither of them wanted to interrupt. On weekday mornings, they reviewed schedules together over breakfast before Nathan attended business meetings, and on weekends they visited schools, neighborhood centers, and local gardens where volunteers gathered to improve public spaces. Somewhere between those ordinary routines, their conversations became longer, their laughter more frequent, and the silence they shared increasingly comfortable. One cool Saturday morning, Nathan invited Evan to visit a botanical garden several miles outside the city after finishing a volunteer event nearby. The foundation had recently sponsored the restoration of several walking trails, and Nathan wanted to see the completed project before it officially opened to the public. As they entered through the stone gates, colorful maple leaves drifted gently across the winding paths, while families strolled peacefully beneath towering trees. Evan smiled with genuine excitement, stopping every few steps to admire unusual flowers or read the small signs describing native plants. Nathan quietly watched him instead of the scenery, noticing how easily Evan found joy in simple moments that many people hurried past without seeing. They eventually reached a quiet pond surrounded by wooden benches where ducks glided slowly across the calm water. Sitting together beneath a large oak tree, they shared warm apple cider purchased from a nearby stand while enjoying the crisp autumn air. "When I was a child," Evan said with a thoughtful smile, "my mother always believed gardens reminded people that healing takes time. You cannot rush a flower into blooming." Nathan looked across the peaceful pond before answering softly, "I think she was right." After a brief silence, Evan asked the question he had carefully avoided for months. "Are you doing better?" Nathan understood immediately what Evan meant. He did not think about legal documents or painful memories before answering. Instead, he reflected on quiet breakfasts, community events, shared conversations, and afternoons spent planting flowers beside someone who never expected recognition. "Yes," Nathan replied honestly. "Not because everything was easy, but because I stopped carrying everything alone." Evan smiled without saying another word, somehow understanding more than any lengthy conversation could have expressed. As the afternoon continued, they wandered through rose gardens, crossed small wooden bridges, and paused to watch children feeding fish beneath colorful trees. Nothing extraordinary happened, yet Nathan realized those ordinary hours had become some of the happiest moments he could remember. On the drive back to the estate, Evan rested his attention on the changing landscape outside the window while quietly humming another familiar melody. Nathan recognized it from the kitchen weeks earlier and found himself smiling before he even realized it. That evening they prepared dinner together for the household staff, instead of leaving everything to the kitchen employees. Mrs. Collins laughed as Nathan struggled to slice fresh bread evenly, while Evan patiently demonstrated a better technique. The entire staff gathered around one long dining table, sharing homemade soup, roasted vegetables, and stories from the day's volunteer work. Looking around the room, Nathan realized the estate no longer felt like a place filled only with employees and responsibilities. It had become a home where people genuinely cared for one another. As the evening drew to a close and everyone wished each other good night, Nathan paused in the quiet hallway outside the kitchen. Through the open doorway, he watched Evan carefully folding kitchen towels with the same attention he gave every task, no matter how small. In that simple moment, Nathan understood that the greatest gift Evan had brought into his life was not merely kindness, but the ability to make ordinary days feel meaningful again. And without either of them noticing exactly when it happened, companionship had quietly become the place where both of their hearts finally felt at home. As winter approached, the work of the Hayes Family Foundation reached neighborhoods that had never before received consistent support. Weekend food programs expanded into after-school tutoring, community gardens produced enough vegetables to supply several local kitchens, and volunteer registrations continued growing month after month. Nathan Hayes remained the driving force behind every major decision, yet he gradually noticed that many people no longer attended events simply because of the foundation's reputation. They came because they had heard about Evan Brooks. Parents remembered how he patiently listened to every concern. Children remembered that he never forgot their names. Elderly residents often waited to greet him with homemade cookies or handwritten thank you cards, insisting that he sit with them for a few extra minutes before returning to work. Every visit reminded Nathan that genuine kindness created connections no business strategy could ever reproduce. One bright Saturday morning, the foundation organized its largest neighborhood celebration of the year at a renovated community park. Colorful tents lined the walking paths. Local musicians filled the air with cheerful melodies, and dozens of volunteers distributed warm meals, books, winter coats, and educational materials. Nathan spent the morning speaking with civic leaders and nonprofit partners, but every time he looked across the park, he found Evan surrounded by smiling families. He watched Evan kneel beside a little girl struggling to tie her shoe, patiently helping her before sending her off with an encouraging smile. A few minutes later, Evan joined a group of senior citizens planting evergreen shrubs near the entrance, laughing warmly as they shared stories from decades earlier. There was never any sign that Evan considered these moments extraordinary. To him, caring for people was simply the natural way to move through the world. During the afternoon, a local newspaper photographer asked if Nathan would stand at the center of the volunteer group for a photograph celebrating the foundation's achievements. Nathan politely agreed, but made one unexpected request. Before the picture was taken, he invited Evan to stand beside him instead of remaining with the volunteers in the background. Evan immediately shook his head. "I belong back there with everyone else," he whispered. Nathan smiled kindly. "You belong wherever the people whose lives you have touched can thank you." Embarrassed by the attention, Evan reluctantly stepped forward while several volunteers applauded with genuine enthusiasm. The photograph captured smiling faces, children holding freshly planted flowers, and neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder. But Nathan knew the image represented something far more meaningful than a successful community event. It reflected a future built through compassion instead of recognition. Later that evening, after equipment had been packed away and the park had grown quiet once again, Nathan and Evan walked slowly toward the parking lot carrying the final box of donated supplies. The cold air carried the scent of pine trees while the first holiday lights began glowing along nearby streets. "I never imagined any of this," Evan admitted softly. "I only wanted to help where I could." Nathan looked at him with quiet admiration. "You never tried to change the world. You simply changed one person's day at a time, and eventually those days became something much bigger." Evan smiled thoughtfully before looking up at the evening sky where the first stars had begun appearing above the city. As they drove back toward the estate, Nathan realized that his definition of success had changed completely. Years earlier, he had measured accomplishment through influence and financial milestones. Now he measured it by shared meals, restored hope, growing friendships, and the quiet smile of the man sitting beside him. Without seeking praise or recognition, Evan had become the heart of every project they built together, and Nathan understood with complete certainty that whatever future awaited them, he wanted every meaningful chapter of it to be written with Evan walking beside him. Nearly 1 year had passed since the quiet morning that had changed everything without either of them realizing it. Winter slowly gave way to the first gentle signs of spring, and the Hayes estate felt more alive than it had in many years. The gardens that Evan Brooks had carefully helped restore were beginning to bloom again. The household staff greeted one another like family, and the Hayes Family Foundation had become a trusted part of the surrounding communities. Nathan Hayes often found himself smiling at small moments that would once have gone unnoticed, knowing they had become the true measure of a meaningful life. 1. Saturday afternoon. While preparing storage rooms for the coming season, Nathan decided to organize several guest closets that had remained untouched for months. He opened one wooden wardrobe after another, sorting neatly folded blankets, winter coats, and forgotten boxes until something familiar caught his attention. Resting carefully on the highest shelf was a white dress shirt folded with remarkable precision. Nathan reached for it almost instinctively. The fabric was still soft, the buttons perfectly fastened, and tucked neatly inside one sleeve was a small handwritten note in Evan's careful handwriting that simply read, "Thank you for your kindness." Nathan stood completely still as memories returned with surprising clarity. He remembered waking after the most difficult night of his life, walking downstairs carrying the weight of disappointment, and finding Evan standing nervously in the kitchen wearing that very shirt. At the time, it had seemed like nothing more than an awkward misunderstanding. Now he understood that it had quietly become the first step toward rebuilding a life that had once felt impossible to repair. Smiling to himself, Nathan carried the shirt downstairs instead of returning it to storage. He walked through the bright hallway until he reached the kitchen, where the familiar scent of fresh bread filled the air once again. Evan stood at the counter preparing lunch with the same calm focus he had shown from the very beginning. Hearing footsteps, he turned and immediately recognized the shirt folded across Nathan's arm. His eyes widened before a gentle laugh escaped him. "You found it," Evan said with a smile. Nathan nodded. "I thought it had disappeared." Evan shook his head. "I wanted to return it long ago, but every time I saw it I remembered that morning. Somehow I could never bring myself to pack it away." Nathan unfolded the shirt and held it carefully between them. "Neither could I," he admitted. They shared a quiet smile that needed no further explanation. Mrs. Collins happened to pass through the kitchen carrying a basket of flowers for the dining room. Seeing the shirt, she laughed warmly. "I wondered how long it would take before one of you found that old memory again." The three of them smiled together before Mrs. Collins quietly continued on her way, leaving Nathan and Evan standing in comfortable silence. A few moments later, they walked outside into the garden where fresh roses were blooming beside the same pathway they had planted together months earlier. Nathan carefully draped the white shirt across a nearby bench before sitting beside it. "It is strange," he said softly. "That morning I thought I had lost everything that mattered." Evan looked toward the colorful flowers moving gently in the spring breeze. "Sometimes life makes room for better things without telling us first." Nathan looked at the familiar shirt resting between them and realized it no longer reminded him of heartbreak or endings. Instead, it had become a quiet symbol of compassion, second chances, and the unexpected beginning of the happiest chapter of his life. As the afternoon sunlight settled across the peaceful garden, both of them understood that some memories were worth keeping forever because they reminded them not of what had been taken away, but of everything beautiful that had arrived afterward. Late spring painted the Hayes estate with vibrant colors as another season of community projects began. The rose garden was now fully in bloom. The walking paths were lined with flowering trees, and laughter from volunteers often drifted across the grounds long before the day's work officially started. What had once been a quiet mansion marked by loneliness had become a welcoming home filled with friendship, purpose, and hope. One evening, after another successful community gathering, Nathan Hayes invited Evan Brooks to the rooftop garden overlooking the city skyline. Soft golden light stretched across the horizon as the sun slowly disappeared beyond the distant buildings, and a gentle breeze carried the familiar fragrance of roses from the gardens below. Nathan carried something carefully folded over his arm. It was the same white dress shirt that had quietly connected their lives nearly a year earlier. He placed it across the wooden bench between them before looking out over the city. "Do you remember what I said that morning?" Nathan asked with a thoughtful smile. Evan looked at the shirt for a moment before laughing softly. "You told me that I did not need to apologize because it was only a shirt." Nathan nodded slowly. "At the time, I believed those words. I thought it was just another ordinary piece of clothing." He gently touched the folded sleeve before continuing. "Now I know it was never only a shirt. It reminds me of the morning when someone showed me kindness without expecting anything in return." Evan remained quiet, listening as the evening sky gradually turned shades of pink and deep blue. Nathan took a slow breath before speaking again. When everything in my life fell apart, I believed I had lost the future I planned so carefully. I kept looking at what had ended instead of noticing what was quietly beginning. Evan smiled warmly. Sometimes the most important doors open so quietly that we only recognize them after we have already walked through. Nathan turned toward him with sincere gratitude reflected in his eyes. You never tried to change my life. You simply cared about the people around you every single day. Watching that changed me more than you will probably ever realize. Evan lowered his eyes for a moment before answering honestly. You changed too. You chose to see people, to listen, and to give them opportunities they never thought they would have. The foundation, the scholarships, the gardens, the families we have met together. None of that would exist without your decision to begin again. They sat together in peaceful silence while the first evening stars appeared above the city. The sounds of the estate below drifted gently upward as household staff finished dinner preparations and volunteers said their goodbyes after another successful day. Everything felt calm, familiar, and wonderfully ordinary. Nathan carefully picked up the white shirt and placed it into Evan's hands. I want you to keep it, he said with a gentle smile. Evan looked surprised. Are you certain? Nathan nodded without hesitation. It no longer belongs to my past. It belongs to the story we created together. Evan carefully held the neatly folded shirt, understanding that it had become far more than fabric. It represented forgiveness, healing, friendship, trust, and the unexpected journey that neither of them could have imagined on that unforgettable morning. As they stood together overlooking the glowing lights of the city, Nathan realized that the greatest choice he had ever made was not rebuilding his business or expanding his foundation. It was allowing himself to accept kindness when his heart needed it most. Evan smiled beside him, and without another word they began walking back toward the warmly lit staircase leading into the home they had filled with compassion. The borrowed white shirt had once symbolized an unexpected encounter between two strangers, but now it represented a shared future built one quiet act of kindness at a time, proving that the smallest moments often become the ones that change an entire lifetime.